encourage you to go ahead and come on and sit down. We're again very pleased to have Dr. Carter back with us, and anxious to hear session 3, The Revenge of the Jedi. No, that's a different session.
Different myth.
Right. So, glad to have Dr. Carter back with us. As always, a reminder that if we ask questions, that we make sure you wait until the mic is with you. That is all because we record these, and the people who listen online can't hear your question if you don't have the mic. All right. Dr. Carter.
Well, good morning, everyone. So, was it cool enough for you this morning?
Yes.
It's a nice shock to the system, was it not? Yes.
I'm so glad.
Very nice. Well, it's good to be back with you, and I've enjoyed our last couple of weeks, so good to be here for this week, and I think I come back next week as well, so that's fine. So thank you. So just to remind you where we have been and what we have been doing, we're looking, using this book and looking at some of the ways that Christian folks have misunderstood things about early Judaism, which has affected our interpretation of the New Testament. Sometimes we've misunderstood because we just don't know, and sometimes we've misunderstood because we're not nice people. And so, we have this long tradition, millennia-long tradition of claims of Christian superiority and Christian supersessionism and denigration of Jewish folks and Judaism and all this sort of stuff, which we've inherited to our advantage often. And so wanting to be honest about that and do some rethinking of some of that material. So we looked at Messiah material 2 weeks ago. And looked at this non-expectation, as I've called it on screen. All Jewish folks were not waiting for a Messiah. And when Jesus turned up, they did not all reject him because they didn't like what he was saying, the way that the Christian myth often spins out. So we looked at some of that. A few folks were looking for a Messiah, but it was very much a minority expectation amongst Jewish folks. And the sort of Messiah folks were expecting was not just one kind. There were different kinds of Messiahs that those folks were looking for, but most folks were not. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the title is not important for Jesus folks. Clearly, it was a fundamental way of talking about Jesus because, as we said, the word Messiah or Christ means anointed or commissioned. So it was a fundamental way for the Jesus folks to say that Jesus is just not any old person, but he's anointed by God. He's commissioned by God. He was appointed by God to do and teach certain things. So it was important for the Jesus folks, but that doesn't mean to say that it was important for everybody else. And to project that is one of the nasty things that we have done. So last week we talked about resurrection, which some Christian folks have claimed is our special deal. This is a special Christian thing. We're the only ones who think about this. And Easter Sunday, of course, high holy day, rah, rah, this is us. Well, yes, it is important to us, but it's not a Christian claim exclusively at all. And there are a number of Jewish traditions about resurrection and a number of traditions about afterlife that don't involve resurrection, afterlife of the soul, for example. And I talked about resurrection last week as emerging in contexts of injustice, in contexts of oppression and tyranny, where the worst that a tyrant could do was to vote you off the island, totally and completely by killing you, right? Which is what happens to Jesus. But of course the resurrection story is that they can't keep him dead. 3 days later, in the immortal words of Home Alone, I'm back. And so resurrection emerges in this context of injustice as an act of justice. of God restoring the person who has been faithful, who is vindicated in this way. And we looked at the particular Christian traditions around resurrection of being somatic and being societal. So a bodily resurrection because God has created all things, so here's an act of faithfulness, but societal in terms of being reconnected with folks as well. Now, in all of this, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that this is what you have to believe. We're not setting up a checklist here. What I am saying is that we have these traditions, so let's understand them at least, and then you can decide what you want to do with them. But let's at least understand how they've developed out of Judaism in relation to there's continuity as well as some distinctive claims. So today, I want to talk about this particular claim that some Christian folks have made about knowing God, experiencing God, revealing God. Of course, we Christians are the only ones who can ever know God, right? Yeah, right. But this is a claim that's been made in some Christian circles. Only through Jesus is God known. It's a Christian exclusive, a Christian superiority. Only through Jesus is God known. And of course, the favourite verse is this one from John's Gospel. Jesus said to Thomas, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you'll know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." So what do we do with this verse? What do we do with this in the tradition? How do we understand it? How did we get this sort of affirmation in John's Gospel? It's distinctive to John's Gospel. How did we get it? What's it drawing on? And how do we understand it? Because it sounds pretty uncompromising, right? It sounds pretty exclusive. Well, let's think about that for a while. Those who appeal to this tradition, to this verse, usually do so and justify it by saying, well, it's in the Bible, so therefore it's absolutely important. Well, the only problem with that is that also in the Bible are a whole bunch of other ways of knowing God. A whole bunch of other ways in which God is experienced, a whole bunch of other ways in which God is made known or is revealed. So I put together just a quick little list here. We have claims that in creation, God is known and encountered and experienced. We have the claim that through the covenant with Abraham, all people of the earth, all families of the earth are blessed. All means all, right? All families, all kin, all folks. In Jewish traditions, God is especially known through the teaching of Moses, what we know as Torah or law, which is given in the context of covenant as a way of helping folks to live faithfully in the covenant. We can think of Torah as kind of guidelines, we can think of it as teaching, we can think of it as helping you to live in the way that God requires. And if you mess up, Torah or the law gives you a way of confessing and repenting and finding forgiveness. Right? All of that's cloaked in the context of covenant, which is an act of God's grace. So this is one of the other things that we could talk about, but one of the other sort of troubling Christian misunderstandings is that Jewish folks were running around doing the law trying to earn God's favour. Well, no, they didn't have to try and earn God's favour. They already had it because God had made covenant with Israel. They already had it. So the law, the Torah, was given as teaching to help folks live faithfully within that covenant relationship. All right? So another way of encountering God through the prophets, again, how to live faithfully, speaking truth to power, all those good things, through historical events, sometimes with blessing, but often with divine displeasure. So that notion that none of us has to this day, that when something bad happens, we must be being punished for something. None of us thinks that anymore, right? Do we? No, never. So, in the year 587, for example, when the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, immediately it's interpreted as God is punishing the people for being unfaithful, right? That's part of that understanding. But God is encountered in historical events. God, of course, is encountered in worship in the temple and in synagogue communities throughout the Roman Empire. So I think it's often interesting that those who want to claim that verse from John's Gospel, the only way of knowing God is through Jesus because it's in the Bible, so is all of this in the Bible. So there are lots of different ways of knowing God. Now we could talk about every one of these, but I want to talk about a particular tradition that is not really very well known, but I think is a really exciting one, and I'm going to call it wisdom traditions. Wisdom traditions. And what we'll do is we'll look at some passages in the Hebrew Bible, we'll look at some passages from early Judaism, and then I want to come back to that verse from John's Gospel about only through Jesus is God known, and think about what that might mean, at least for a few minutes. So let me be clear on what these wisdom traditions are. Wisdom is kind of shorthand for knowing, encountering God, God's presence, God's purposes. Okay? So wisdom in this tradition is being used as a shorthand to refer to knowing God's purposes, knowing God's will, knowing God's presence. Okay? So there's no point looking it up in the Oxford English Dictionary or one of the others, because that's not what it'll tell you. But that's how we're using it in this tradition. So wisdom is a tradition that reveals God's actions among people in the world. Okay? So it's making God known amongst folks in the world. Now, how does that happen? We'll come back to that in a moment. One of the ways it happens is that in the tradition, wisdom gets personified. All right? So if I just say wisdom, then that's a bit abstract, right? So in the tradition, wisdom becomes a person who works among human beings, who makes God known among human beings. So it's a picture. It's an illustration. It's a metaphor. And that person is personified as a woman. So she's known as Lady Wisdom. And she is the representation of God's actions, God's presence among human beings. And she's all over the place, making God known. Okay? Making sense so far? All right? Well, she reveals the divine purposes. She guides people. She reveals God's presence among people. She's active in the world as a way of saying this is what God is doing in the world. She's a picture. She's a metaphor. She's not literal, right? She's a way of talking about God at work in the world. She's a mediator. She's a revealer. She makes known well-being from life in relation to God. So if you know wisdom, you know God. She brings life and well-being in relationship to God. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? Except that human existence is never that easy. So at the same time as Lady Wisdom is trotting around the world, busily revealing God to people in everyday life, so too is Lady Folly, or Lady Iniquity, as she's also known. Lady Foolishness, opposing what Lady Wisdom is doing, trying to turn people away from God's presence and God's purposes and God's will, trying to thwart oppose, is hostile to what Lady Wisdom is doing. Which, of course, puts human beings in the middle, right? And so constantly from both Lady Wisdom and Lady Foolishness, or Lady Folly, there's this choice. Which way are you going to live? Where are you going to sort of plant your flag? Where are you going to make your commitments? Are you going to be faithful to God, or are you going to live in a way that turns away from God and ignores God, right? So it understands human existence as a struggle over loyalty and commitments. Am I the only one who experiences this? Am I my own here? Okay, that's wisdom tradition. So she's this illustration, she's this picture. She works among human beings to make God known. So she comes from God, she reveals God, she makes God known, and folks can search for her and accept her teaching, her guidance, or you can say no and trot off with Lady Folly. Okay? So far so good? Anyone want to talk about any of that? And we'll look at some examples. Okay, now there's a few texts here, and I actually put them on your outline, so you might need a magnifying glass for some of them. But, there's a limit to how many trees I can kill, so... Now, this understanding of wisdom is a tradition that develops across time. All right, it develops across centuries as folks think about it more and more. So this is where it starts, that wisdom, God's ways and presence, are known in creation. And if you observe creation enough, then you can see God's ways. So this is from Job. But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? So if you observe the birds and the fish and the trees and the plants, then you know God as the giver of life. Right? You encounter God as creator, the giver of life. In God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. God is responsible for this whole thing. God has given life to this whole existence. With God are wisdom and strength. God has counsel and understanding. Okay? So that's where this wisdom thing begins, by observing creation, by looking at the plants and the animals and all the rest of it, and you discern something of who God is and what God is about. So far so good? I remember once upon a time, one of my kids, she must have been 7th or 8th grade at the time, had this assignment to do from one of their classes where they had to mark out a sort of a square somewhere on their section, on their yard, sort of a metre by a metre, yard by a yard. And then each day for 4 or 5 days they had to go out and they had to stare at this area of ground, and then they had to write down things that they observed. So after day 2, when she'd dutifully taken a stool outside and stared at this ground, her father, who is pretty wicked, decided that he would get little post-it notes and put them on toothpicks, and he would write on the post-it notes things like, "Stop being a voyeur," and "Leave us alone," and "Go away," and "Leave the neighbourhood." And
That's just mean.
Yeah, so he put these things in the ground, and so she takes a stool outside on about the 3rd day and looks at, "Dad!" So, how did she know I was responsible? Terrible. Anyway, I always think of that when I think of this passage. So this is where wisdom tradition begins, but it soon becomes this tradition around a personified figure, a woman. So let's have a look at another passage. Now, notice the way that this is personified now with a person. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portal, she cries out, "To you, O people, I call. My cry is to all that live." Okay? So it's not just a matter of observing creation now. It's an idea that she, and she's a woman, personified as a female figure, is working amongst human beings and calling people to know God's will, to know God's presence, to know God's purposes. And she's doing it, notice where? On the heights. So if you've got any hills or mountains, she's doing it there. Beside the way, wherever the roads are, at the crossroads, and beside the gates in front of the town and the entrance ways to towns. She's everywhere where there are people. And she's summoning people. She's calling people. And this is a picture of God revealing God's self and trying to call people into relationship with God. Okay? That's the picture. She's trying to call people into relationship, to encounter God. All right? Now that was from Proverbs. Let's try a little bit more from Proverbs. So now she's talking about herself and basically saying, here are my creds. Here's my CV. Here's my resume. Right? Why do I have the right to reveal God? You know, what's so special about me? What's the basis for me to reveal God? Well, this is what she says. I'll read it off here and then I won't get a crook neck. I can't see it on here. That's the trouble. I'll read it off here. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before God had made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When God established the heavens, I was there. When God drew a circle on the face of the deep, isn't that a marvelous image? When God drew a circle on the face of the deep, when God made firm the skies above, when God established the fountains of the deep, when God assigned to the sea its limits, then I was beside him, like a master worker. I was daily God's delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in God's inhabited world and delighting in the human race. So what are wisdom's creds? Why should she be the one who reveals God? She was there with God. And did she just sort of drop by after God had been at it for a while? From the beginning, right? She's with God from the beginning. Yes?
Okay, so is this where the sacred feminine establishes?
Whether something...
The sacred feminine?
Yes.
Okay, because that's part of my biggest problem with my upbringing is it's always been penile-oriented.
Yes. So this is, it's very explicit that she's a woman and she reveals God in all this activity. And she can do so, not because she's any old body, but she's there in the beginning. She sees God as creator, but not just does she witness it. Then I was beside him like a master worker. I was daily his delight. So there's a sense of accompanying God, even in the act of creation. She's with God. Okay? Any other comments, questions? Okay. So she rejoices in the inhabited world, delights in the human race, and now, she's among human beings calling and inviting. Now, children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. ways. Why my ways? Because they're God's ways. Because I reveal God. Happy are those. I don't like that translation of happy. A much better I'm not opposed to happiness, but I understand it's not a bad idea and experience. I've been told that. I'd much rather we had a translation of blessed are those, because this is divine presence, it's divine favour. All right? But anyway, that's what we've got. And we get it again in verse 34. Happy is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favour from the Lord. Okay? So if you find wisdom, if you respond to her call, which is everywhere, then you encounter God and you encounter God's favour. But it's not always that easy, is it? Those who miss me injure themselves. All who hate me love death. So again, we've got that alternative. Here is a revelation of God's life, of God's favour, of God's purposes. If you buy into it, there are good rewards. If you don't, there are other consequences. Now, this is also in Proverbs chapter 8. All right? Yeah, ma'am.
So is this inclusive for Jewish people reading these texts? It includes anyone who's following this wisdom, but not necessarily of their faith.
At this stage in the tradition, it is particularly about Israel and Jewish folks, but not exclusively at this stage. Now, one of the things we're going to see in a few minutes is that it does become more restrictive. But at this stage in the tradition, all people, anyone, can do this. And one of the things I'm not sure about is that when, in some of the later texts, which we'll look at, when it becomes more restrictive, I'm not sure if this sort of broad inclusiveness is thereby done away with, or if we're just sort of being more particular among Jewish folks. And I don't know how to answer that question. But I think it's a real question. But at this stage, I'm pretty clear. This is all folks. All right? So, and here, now we get some of this narrowing down in this tradition, because it's a moving one. So, again, wisdom talking. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth. All right? So she begins with God. I dwelt in the highest heavens. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven and traversed the depths of the abyss, over waves of the sea, over all the earth, over every people and nation. So there's an answer to the question. I held sway. Among all of these I sought a resting place. So now we begin to get this narrowing down. I sought a resting place. In whose territory should I abide? Then the Creator of all things gave me a command, and my Creator chose the place for my tent. God said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. So particularly in Jacob and Israel. And this is what I meant a few minutes ago. Does this mean that her activity over every people and nation no longer applies, and it's all gotten narrowed down? Or is she doing all of this, but she's sort of got a home base here, and she can still do all of this? I don't know the answer to that. I think you can read it both ways. I'm not sure. In the beginning, God created me, and for all the ages I shall not cease to be. But this is where she's landed. In the holy tent, I ministered before God, and I was established in Zion. Zion, of course, is just language for Jerusalem. And the holy tent is the temple in Jerusalem. So particularly in the temple in Jerusalem, wisdom is made known. So we're talking about Sabbath observances, we're talking about festival observances like Passover and Day of Atonement, all those things. We're also talking about a place where the teaching of Moses is read as well, right? So she's particularly associated there. I took root in an honoured people, in the portion of the Lord, his heritage. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us as an inheritance for the congregations of Jacob. So, she's got some new dwelling places. She's with God's people, she's in Jerusalem, in the temple, and she's also known through the teaching of Moses. But we've still got this stuff about working everywhere, and somewhere that's in the mix. I know what my charitable reading would be, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay? So she's busy revealing God in all these different ways in all these different places, making God's presence, making God's will known everywhere. All right? This is our God. No other can be compared to God. God found the whole way to wisdom and gave her to his servant Jacob and to Israel, whom he loved. So the tradition is still doing this narrowing down. Afterward, she appeared on earth and lived with humankind. So we're wobbling again. So it's not just Israel, but now we've got humankind. And if it was just Israel, we wouldn't have a noun like humankind, which suggests everybody. This is from Baruch, which is in the Apocrypha. She is the book of the commandments of God, the law that endures forever. All who hold her fast will live, and those who forsake her will die. Turn, O Jacob, which is just another word for Israel, take her, walk toward the shining of her light. So she's inviting people into relationship with God, into divine presence, into the divine purposes. She can't compel people, she can't force them, she's inviting into relationship and into partnership. And again, we've got a particular link with the teaching of Moses. So she's not being set up over against Moses, but she's in sync with Moses, in sync with Moses' teaching and commands. Okay? We doing all right so far? All right. There will be a test. Now, so we've got this wisdom, God's presence being manifested with all humankind in creation, and then particularly in Jerusalem, in the temple, amongst Jewish folks, and particularly in the teaching from Moses, right? Now, another text. This also comes from the Apocrypha, a collection called the Wisdom of Solomon. And Solomon, as you know, is the great wise guy. You know, he's the guy who's associated with wisdom. How did he get that wisdom? He's the king. How does he know how to rule well? So, as part of this document called the Wisdom of Solomon, which is written 1,000 years after Solomon's dead. Now, being able to write after you're dead, I think, is quite an accomplishment. I'm hoping for this gift. But I don't know how you get it. We have lots of texts in the name of Solomon, long after he's dead. You know, there's a whole tradition of followers of Solomon. You might remember when we talked about the Messiah, one of those Messiah texts was the Psalms of Solomon. Psalms written in the name of Solomon. So he's quite prolific, long after he's been dead. So here he is again. How does he get to be wise? How does he get to rule well? How does he get to be a wise king? Well, wisdom gets in on the act. So we have this passage in Wisdom of Solomon chapter 7 where he praises wisdom because he wants to encounter her to make God's will known. She is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Whatever else that verse means, we're stretching for language, right? We're really stretching it. She is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God. All right? So if you see wisdom, she reflects what God is doing. She manifests what God is doing. An image of God's goodness. Although she is one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God. How's that for a lovely image? She passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. So she's revealing God, she's making God known, she's inviting people into relationship with God, to be friends with God. For God loves nothing so much as the person who lives with wisdom. Compared with the light, she is found to be superior. The light is succeeded by the night. But against wisdom, evil does not prevail. So there's a sort of a poke in the eye for Lady Folly, Lady Iniquity. She cannot prevail against this making known of God and God's presence.
I got a question.
Yes.
So you were mentioning wisdom doesn't force herself on people so basically for her to pass through people, they have to be willing.
Yes, that they're inviting her. Right.
They're inviting her in.
Exactly.
Yes.
So she's not forcing herself on or into, but she's inviting people to be in this relationship with God that she makes available. Yeah, good clarification. Always, wisdom is sort of this incredibly mystical sort of figure, but very accessible. And we've got this sort of paradox that, on one hand, she's a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. It's a sentence I didn't think I'd say today, And yet, here she is making folks be friends with God. So we've got both of these things.
It's just eye-opening because when you think about, we had God before the Bible. So you can't say you only can know God through the Holy Bible.
Right. And
God has always been there.
Yeah, and this tradition is saying that wisdom has always been doing this because she was there in the beginning with God. And so because she was in the beginning with God, she's always been making God available. But she's not, as we saw in the last couple of passages, she's not opposed to the teaching of Moses. She's allied with it, but she's not confined by it either.
Right.
She was in existence before Moses. She's in existence apart from Moses. She's doing her thing everywhere. Good allies with Moses, the people that, you need to line up to be on your side. But she's not confined by Moses either. Yeah. So, what does Solomon do with this, since, he's so enamored with wisdom? So he says to God in a prayer, "With you, God, is wisdom. She who knows your works and was present when you made the world." And God says at this point, "Well done, Solomon, you've been paying attention." All right, so we've seen that all the way, that she was present with God when God made the world. She knows God's works, right? We've seen that a bunch of times now. She understands what is pleasing in your sight and what is right according to your commandments. And again, God nods and says, "Well done, Solomon, you've been paying attention." But now Solomon makes his petition. "Send her forth from the holy heavens, from the throne of your glory send her, that she may labor at my side, and that I may learn what is pleasing to you." So here's Solomon inviting wisdom to come and be his teacher, to be his guide, to be with him, because she will manifest God's presence and God's purposes for him as king. For she knows and understands all things. She will guide me wisely in my actions and guard me with her glory. Then my works will be acceptable, and I shall judge, and in Bible talk that means I will rule I will rule your people justly, and shall be worthy of the throne of my father David. Who has learned your counsel, unless you have given wisdom and sent your Holy Spirit from on high? This is not a Jesus text, right? This is not a Christian text. So we've got Holy Spirit equated with wisdom. Wisdom and the Holy Spirit are the same thing. And thus the paths of those on earth were set right, and people were taught what pleases you, and were saved by wisdom, making God known, making God's presence known, manifesting God. Okay, I'd like you to do something, please. Oh, we'll do one more, and then I'd like you to do something. So here's Solomon being all welcoming, being all receiving, inviting wisdom, God, to be present with him, to instruct him, to teach him. But it doesn't always work like that. So here's another passage from a text called First Enoch, which is in the pseudepigrapha. It's a very big, long text. Then wisdom went out from heaven to dwell with the children of the people, and she found no dwelling place. So wisdom returned to her place, and she settled permanently among the angels. Then iniquity went out of her rooms and found whom she did not expect. In other words, she expected people to be receptive to wisdom, but they weren't, so they were receptive to iniquity. She dwelt with them like rain in a desert and dew on a thirsty land. So here's an explanation as to why there is horrible evil on planet Earth, why we do dreadful things to one another as human beings, because there was no place for wisdom. We were not receptive to this revelation of God. We weren't receptive to it. So Lady Iniquity moved in instead, and we know the consequences. Now, it's painted very much in stark terms, right? I mean, I think I'd want to say to the first part, well, yeah, occasionally we humans can actually do some good things with one another. Occasionally we have good moments. So I'd want to say it's not quite that bad. And likewise, Lady Iniquity doesn't always have her way. There are ways of resisting. But you see the picture and the explanation for it. Questions? Okay, this is what I'd like you to do. You'll hate me for it, but hey, so what? What I'd like you to do is talk to the person next to you and tell each other, what's this wisdom thing that he's talking about? What's important about this Lady Wisdom figure? 2 minutes. Go. Okay, 15 seconds, 15 seconds. Okay. Any comments or feedback or questions that would be helpful for us? Clarifying? Corinthians running.
We were just talking about there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom.
Sure.
Wisdom comes with life experience, and you can be wise without being intelligent, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more of the vice versa than I'd argue. But anyway, and then we talked about going back to the wisdom from nature and all of that, and it just reminded me of like Francis of Assisi, seeing God in everything.
Yeah, we've got mystics who have done that, yes.
And it's just interesting, and that's the way I look at it. I see God in everything, even my cat.
Yes, everywhere. That's Proverbs invites people to consider the ants, that even there. Yeah, so the important thing to note out of that is that wisdom is being used in a particular way in this tradition, right? So you're right, wisdom and understanding, wisdom and intelligence, we can parse those out in different ways. But this is a particular definition of wisdom as a revelation of God's purposes and presence. Okay? That's a key piece. So it's not just, do you have enough street smarts to get yourself through the day, or enough institutional smarts to keep your job? It's not just that. It's about this disclosure, this revelation, this manifestation of God's purposes and God's presence among human beings. Okay? So keep that definition in mind. Yeah.
The thing jumped out at me in this earlier reading, a couple slides back, was that wisdom was salvific.
Yes.
And so if you juxtapose that from the John, I am the way, the truth, and life, I mean, how dissimilar that is to kind of the mainstream proclamation of Christianity, particularly in its conservative. And I would think that, I think we progressives have tried to see Jesus as standing within the wisdom tradition. And I just wonder how much friction there would be. It's like, wait a minute, so Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, but then there's this other text that says wisdom is salvific. I wonder what a struggle that might create or not.
And it gets even more struggly because we just read that piece about wisdom being the Holy Spirit, right? So we just added another layer to the piece. Well, I'm going to make some comments about that in a few minutes because I want to come back to the John piece. But I'm glad you held it up because, when God is present among folks, when God is doing God's thing, when that is being known and encountered, then yes, it is salvific. It's about salvation. It's about rescuing folks. It's about guiding folks. It's about instructing folks. So it's not about salvation as, God's sort of saving some little wee souly bit somewhere. I don't even know where my souly bit is. And then God doesn't care about the rest. You'll notice, here's King Solomon wanting wisdom to know how to rule properly, how to be a king. That's not just about saving his little souly bit, that's about guiding the whole people. Wisdom is, and if we are going to observe the creation, then wisdom is big. The divine purposes are everywhere to be discerned and acknowledged and found. But yeah, salvific, rescuing us. Good, yeah.
Okay, I have a question. I'm a language teacher.
Yes.
Latin languages, taught French for 28 years, right? And I'm sure you are well aware that in the Latin languages, everything is male and female.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I came in late. So trying to understand this, I'm doing my own little digging, just like, okay. What I'm finding from the almighty internet is that the language this was written in was also like Latin languages. Everything was referred to as a boy or a girl. Wisdom was a feminine word.
Yes.
And even in modern Latin language, if I want to say it in French, I have to say she.
You have to use a pronoun.
Okay.
Elle.
My question is then, was the word it available at this time? Or is this simply the word God was masculine, so therefore it turned into masculinity and patriarchal,
Yeah.
and wisdom was feminine, a feminine word, so therefore it just means a word.
Yeah. In Hebrew, the word for wisdom is chokmah, and that's feminine. And in Greek, which is what Wisdom of Solomon's written in, for example, the word is Sophia. You know somebody called Sophia? Wise lady. So Sophia is feminine. And in Greek, we have pronouns that are masculine and feminine and neuter. So referring to wisdom, one would use a feminine pronoun. So in the translations, mostly I think from what we've seen, they're gender sensitive in terms of she, but occasionally we'll have an it, which is simply an English translation deal. It's not an original language thing. So it's very clear she's a woman. It's very clear that she invites, she manifests, she reveals, she displays what God is doing.
She acts like a woman.
She acts like a woman.
Because she acts like a woman that's so personified, then we should interpret the word she, it to be an actual woman figure.
As an image, as a picture, as a mirror, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's important because, we've got this personification which encourages us to think literally, but she's not a separate being. I mean, she's not a separate person. She's still an image, and it's a way of trying to picture, God doing all these things, God self-disclosing, God self-revealing amongst people and inviting people into relationship with God.
So if the word wisdom is feminine and personified, the word God, was it a masculine word?
Usually it's masculine.
And therefore, it's also a concept that's merely personified? Could I, in my liberal thinking, translate it that
Absolutely.
way?
Absolutely. Yes. Go forth and translate. Anyone else? Okay, let's see if we can pull this together, because I want to get back to that John piece before we quit. So, just to remind you of this slide, which we've now worked through some text, so I hope this makes a little more sense now. God is active among people, this personification of this female figure who is showing God at work, metaphor, comparison, a picture, a mirror, whatever image you want, personified as Lady Wisdom, revealing the divine purposes, presence, will, purposes, activity in the world. So this is very much an activist God sort of understanding. God is busy. So God didn't shut up shop and just go away. God is active among human beings and known. She's a mediator, she's a revealer, she makes God known, and in terms of encountering God, one encounters God's good life. Okay? She's also opposed by Lady Iniquity, Lady Folly. This might help to put some of the pieces together as well, because you can think of this as a spirituality. You can think of it as a way of understanding God at work in the world, but it's got paradoxes in it. It's not just very simple and naive. So wisdom personifies God's power and presence, which we've seen, but she also protects monotheism. She's not another God. She's a revelation of God. She is immanent in creation. That means you can encounter her by observing the fish and the trees and the birds and the ants and all the rest of it. But she's not confined in creation. She's also distinct from it. Okay? You can encounter her there, but she's not bound up in it only. She's a heavenly female figure, but she's active on earth. She's a revealer figure. She keeps inviting, but she's also elusive. She's not going to force herself. You've got to go looking for her. You've got to be receptive to her. You've got to be open to her. You've got to receive her invitation. She mediates life, but if you tell her to take a hike, then death results. Okay, we've got a life and death paradigm. She invites, but she's also rejected. She mediates God's presence among humans. And she's encountered in a number of places, amongst the people, creation, Torah, temple, kings, and I added Jesus to the list. Why did I do that? Just because it's church and we have to talk about Jesus? No. All right, let's come back to the Gospel of John. What I'm going to suggest to you in the Gospel of John, and just from reading the thing, that John talks about Jesus in distinctive ways. John's a bit different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What I suggest to you is that the writer of John's Gospel, and we don't know who that is, interprets Jesus in the key of wisdom, to use a musical metaphor. The presentation of Jesus in John's Gospel is Jesus as wisdom. And the writer of John's Gospel is borrowing this material that we've just been talking about and says, you want to talk about knowing God? You want to talk about revealing God? You want to talk about God's invitation to live in good life with God? Think about Jesus as wisdom. And you know all about wisdom. She's trotting around everywhere, inviting people and revealing God and all the rest of it. Think about Jesus in those terms. That's what I think the Gospel of John is doing. So, I'm going to come back to this verse. So, I think the author is borrowing this understanding of wisdom. And you know how John's Gospel begins. It's the only Gospel that begins with, "In the beginning was the Word." Now, what do words do? Communicate, reveal, they make something known, they can invite. They can also do terrible damage, but we're doing the good stuff at the moment. All right? They reveal, they communicate, they invite. So Jesus is set up in the opening verse, in the beginning was the Word, the communication, the revelation. And what gives Jesus creds to be a revealer of God? The Word was God, but before that, the Word was with God. Right. Okay? So in the beginning, like wisdom, as wisdom, Jesus is there with God. And so Jesus can be the revealer of God. So throughout John's Gospel, Jesus reveals God in God's knowability, visibility, and I came up with another itty word, audibility. So here are the verses. Come on, yes, here's the verses. So Jesus makes God known as a revealer. If you know me, you know my Father. If whoever has seen me has seen the Father. The words that I say, I do not speak on my own. They're God's words. The Father who dwells in me does his works. It's good, eh? So I think that the author of John's Gospel is presenting Jesus as wisdom in these sorts of terms, the revealer of God. And so when we come back, and I'm doing this very quickly, I was going to show you the same sort of diagram, but we're going to skip over that. I'm going to skip over this because these are all common features between Jesus and wisdom, which we could make up that list ourselves. John's Gospel, I think, comes from a situation of conflict. That the Jesus folks are part of a synagogue community. And after the events of 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, there were big discussions amongst Jewish folks about what's the way ahead. How do we know what to do now? We've got no temple, Jerusalem is in ruins, the priesthood has been destroyed, and those Romans have slapped a tax on us which says that we're just a miserable lot of defeated people who have no worth on the planet. How do we live? Who are we? What's the way ahead? And I think in the group from which John's Gospel comes, part of a synagogue, when they talk about these questions, how do we know what God wants us to do? How do we know what God's will is? Why would God be punishing us through the Romans? What did we do wrong? The Jesus folks, who I think are a minority in the synagogue community, wave their little hands and say, oh, Jesus is the answer. Why? Because Jesus is wisdom. Jesus has made God known. And if you commit to Jesus, you will know the way that you're supposed to live. You will know the divine purpose. You will encounter the divine purposes. And I think is that making sense? Mm-hmm. And I think it's precisely in that context that we get this verse. I think it's polemic. I think it's fight. It's fight talk. We are the folks who know that through Jesus, God is known, and only through Jesus. So why don't you come and join our side? Come over this side of the room. Come over this side of the room. Come and join us. And I think that's what the verse is doing. And it's collapsing all the stuff that we've seen about wisdom revealing God in all sorts of different ways, collapsing it to Jesus. Because you know what happens in polemic, you know what happens in fights. You've got to make it simple, right? Complexity and nuance are not the features of fight talk. If you've been in a relationship with another human being for at least 5 minutes, you know this. All right? And so this is John's big claim, that only in Jesus is God's presence known. Only in Jesus is this where it's at. All right? We have to quit. Thank you for hanging in for 3 extra minutes. All right.